Hey everybody, it's Alex once again from Remote Work Life, and today I have an exceptional guest, a guest that I've had in the past that I just had to have back again because we had such an interesting conversation last time around, and I can't believe it was best part of 3 years ago that we had this conversation.
So long ago. So much has happened.
So much, and I think in that case, hopefully we've got quite a lot to talk about and catch up on. I have Dan Yoder with me today, who is CEO of DashKite. You can find DashKite at dash and kite, KITE.com. As I said, Dan is the CEO of DashKite. DashKite is a next generation no-code, and DashKite is developing a revolutionary generative programming platform for building consent-driven applications without writing code. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast again.
It's a pleasure to be back, Alex.
Yeah, it's great.
I was just going to say thank you for the chance to be a guest here again.
Yeah, it's the pleasure is mine, Dan. And as I said, a lot of time has passed since we last spoke. And obviously, I want to catch up on where you are at the moment with DashKite. You've launched this new startup. We're still with PandaStrike, of course, but tell me what's happened. Eddie, just summarize what's happened in the last few years since we last spoke.
Well, when we last spoke, so DashKite was there. It existed. It was in research mode, though. We were researching this idea of being able to do what's quite a mouthful, generative programming for consentful applications. So we can get into what the heck that all means. But we were sort of in a research mode, sort of researching the viability of what we wanted to do. Since then, we've moved into kind of a product development mode, and that's why we're talking about that more. And PandaStrike, which is a development services shop that I founded back in 2012, is still up and running. But the focus in terms of what I'm sort of talking about these days is more on the DashKite side, because we're now into doing product launches, and so that's a very exciting phase of the company's evolution.
And as with PandaStrike, DashKite, fully remote business as well. I'm assuming, of course, I think if I remember rightly, you've been developed. I mean, it's been over a decade, is it, since you've been building remote development teams and remote tech teams? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So when we started PandaStrike, we decided that was going to be remote development and with remote developers. So not just remote from the client's perspective, but the developers themselves are remote. One of the interesting things that's happened in the last several years since we last spoke is we've branched out more internationally. So it's quite fascinating. We have developers now all over the world, so we've really leaned into the remote aspect of it, but DashKite, obviously that model works extremely well for reasons that we can get into, and we decided, obviously we were just going to continue building on that experience with DashKite.
Well, as we're on the subject of DashKite, tell us more then about, because you mentioned generative programming, and what is that all about then, Dan? What are you building there? Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, you've probably seen some of the hype around generative AI and the chat GPT and all this. And so if you think of it, this isn't that, but the word generative is the operative word here. So it's similar in that instead of providing, like, if you look at something like chat GPT, for example, right, you can say something like, tell me a joke, and chat GPT will come up with a joke, right? And so the generative aspect of that is that you can give sort of high level direction and you get much more detailed feedback, right? You go between, the way we think of it is in terms of this notion of integrative levels. So you have like in biology, right? We have, there's cells, and then there's organs, and then there's the body, and then there's, communities and cities, and these are all different integrative levels, right? When we're talking about cities, we don't have to talk about the cells in our bodies. And so you can think of generative being, I want to give you a description at one integrative level, but you're going to do something at the levels below it. So when we talk about cities, we can imagine that there are all these people, and the people all have, bodily organs, and those organs have cells, and we know all that's there. And that's the idea of generative, right? You say something at a high level and you get this detailed, tell me a joke and you get a whole joke, right? So that's what the generative is about, is being able to provide some general input. I want a website that does these things, and you get back an actual website that has a reasonably coherent design. And that's in contrast with, say, visual programming, right? So where there are tools like Webflow, for example, where you would go in and you're doing more or less what a code-based programmer would do. You're just doing it visually.
Right.
So generative programming is intended to give you this idea that you're providing this high-level direction and the details are taken care of. So it's more like how you might talk to a designer instead of having to learn how to do design. And then the consent part of it, so the consent-driven applications, and part of the reason that we're able to do the generative programming is we're focused around a specific kind of application that we call consentful. And there's a great movement. In fact, there's a website that I'd like to call out called Consentful Tech. I think it's Consentful Tech.io. And it talks about this notion of consent in application design. It's a really neat movement. It has to do with things like, well, primarily around the idea of giving applications consent. So if I'm going to use your data for something, you have to give me consent for that. If you're going to, keep track of something, even if you don't have any nefarious intent with the data, you still have to ask for consent. And so if we think of ourselves as having digital bodies, that's the metaphor the consentful tech movement is based around. And just as you would need consent for, with respect to your physical person, we need to embrace this idea that we need to as application developers and in the technology business, we should be doing the same thing. We need consent from with respect to someone's digital body. So being able to build those kinds of apps, which is highly relevant in an era of GDPR, type regulations, where I think there's going to be more and more of that kind of stuff, and more not having that consent is going to be a liability. And so, but even if it wasn't, it's the right thing to do, right? So there's an ethical aspect to it. So what we want to do is make it easier to build consentful applications than it is not to. I think part of the problem right now is that it is very difficult to build consentful applications. And so if we can make that the default, the easier thing to do, I think most people would prefer to do the right thing. It's just, when the right thing and the easy thing are at odds, or when the right thing is the hard thing, it just makes it less likely that people are able to do that. And particularly for groups that have not, been historically included in being able to participate in the tech industry or build applications, generative programming promises to remove a big barrier to being able to participate and to build applications and make it possible to empower people. And so while doing that, we want to be empowering them to also do the right thing in the form of building consentful applications.
And is there, because I know you mentioned that it's you're in startup mode, is there an example of somebody or some sort of use case you can share with us in terms of, or an example case study that you can share with us how you're building something out with DashKite?
Well, at the moment, we're still sort of doing private beta type so we don't have we don't have an actual case study or a customer, a lighthouse customer that we can point to. One company we have been working pretty closely with is a company called Homeroom, and they're focused on helping people build communities around that are sort of consentful communities in Discord. And so we've built some of their back-end tooling, and we're doing some work with them. We've also worked not as a company, but as individuals working, bringing our past relationships in. We've worked in an experimental community called Small Town, which is essentially focused around communities where it's kind of like, imagine it's sort of like a consentful next door, but maybe a little bit more in a federated model. So more like being able to run your own instance of a community platform with moderation and so forth. That's all local, as opposed to being something that has one big platform with one moderation authority for what might be thousands of individual communities, which doesn't always make sense.
And the last time we spoke, you left a real impact on me in terms of the way you approach work and your just your general ethics, and it made me think. 'Cause when we left that particular podcast, there was so many more questions that I had to ask you, but obviously we had limited time, and this is another reason I wanted to get you back on today. And from what you were just describing there, even the fact that you're building something now, that it seems as though, obviously ethics and empowering people is something that is really, people in general are something that's important to you. Is there a particular, I don't know, a story or experience in your life that has influenced who you are today and help you to define who you are?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know. There's so many. Right. I think a lot of. So there's some that were negative. There were some of it is like just having experiences where you felt like maybe you could do more, or there were opportunities that were there to do more in terms of creating value, or just doing the right thing for the customer. And those moments of frustration can contribute to it, of saying, hey, I would like to be part of doing something that makes the world better, rather than just, I think everybody kind of has that, right? People want something that's fulfilling. You want to feel like you're contributing more than just making, a paycheck, ideally. And so seeing that, and then just being inspired by seeing people who have just, that have done that, right? That have said, okay, people who in many cases could have done many, many things, but they chose to focus on, trying to make the world a better place. So I don't know that there was a specific, situation or experience. A lot of it's just people that I've seen that have inspired me and helped me realize, it is possible to do that. It is a choice. It's difficult to get to a position, and I think this is, part of this idea of empowering people partly comes from realizing in my own life experience just how hard it has been to be in a position where you can, and this doing the podcast, right? I mean, getting into a position where, you can make that choice is, it takes a lot to get there. And maybe if part of what we want to do is be working together to, make that choice a little easier for people, right? So that more people can say, I want to do something that's meaningful. I kind of got a kick out of the quiet quitting phase, right? Because I feel like part of what was going on there, right, was people finding that maybe they did have a choice, and that they weren't maybe, it's like, well, okay, you could look at that as a failure of the workers, but okay, but maybe it's also a failure of the companies employing those people not to be able to inspire or motivate them, right? And so it's all these experiences, I think, and so many, mostly I think just seeing amazing people doing amazing things, and saying, I want to try to be a part of that if I can.
Got it. I know that you mentioned people who have inspired you. Are there any, people that specifics that you can share with us who's inspired you in your career, or just in generally in life at all?
Yeah. I kind of hesitate to call anyone out because there's just so many people, and I kind of, it's like one of those things where
you don't want to miss anybody out.
Yeah. But I'll mention one person just as an example, just because they came to mind. But Laura Weidman Powers, who is an extremely talented person, and she could have done a lot of things, and the things that she's chosen to do, she decided to do. She founded Code 2040, which was focused on addressing DEI in tech, and then has gone on as, I think she's now still as a partner at Base 10 Ventures, where she is working on a fund that contributes the earnings from the fund to HBCUs. So, I mean, that's just an example. There's lots of other people, but just this it just came to mind. That's a great example in the sense of somebody who's just extremely talented, could have done anything really, and those are the kinds of choices that she made. And I find that kind of thing to be very inspiring, to know that those people are out there, right? There's, for all of the bad news and the negativity that we hear in the world, right? There are awful lot of people just out there doing great work, and day by day, and they don't necessarily get a lot of headlines or accolades, or but collectively we're all making the world a better place, and it adds up. All these little things that you can do, it may not seem like much in any individual case, but it adds up, and in the end, that's what it takes, I think.
And I think that's one of the things that inspired me to not just start this podcast, but also continue, because I've had my share of moments where I think to myself, am I doing the right thing here? But I think I want to be able to put a spotlight on those people who are doing, the work, the ones that aren't necessarily heralded in the media, or the ones that aren't necessarily shouting about what they're doing. I want to be able to use this medium to do that. And because, like you said, people like Laura Weidman Powell, if she's doing Powers, sorry, she's doing that work for DEI, then it's really important. And do you think, because there's a lot that's been said about underrepresentation in tech, and lots of people talk about diversity, etc. In your mind, do you see any sort of any changes or improvements in sort of take up for tech roles from your sort of sphere of your network, or just from a general perspective?
I think the tech industry in general has just failed in that. I don't think that they've made any progress that's worth. I think the progress has been made. There's individual examples, I think, of either within companies where there are managers or director or even VP level people who are really trying to do better. And outside the tech industry, there's probably a lot of examples. I'm not as familiar with, I know the tech industry more, but within the tech industry, yeah, I think it's just, just not happening.
And that's sad. It's sad. And I think there's like I said, because I'm looking from I suppose a recruitment hiring perspective, you see a lot of adverts saying, we do this and we do that. We try and do this, we try to do that to encourage people from different backgrounds, etc. But for one reason or another, like as you were alluding to, it's not quite happening. It's not quite getting there. But
yeah, because if you look at it like analytically, there's just no evidence that it's improving. So there's all this talk for sure. There's a lot of, like you said, the, ads always mention it. But, and, they'll be, on, like something like Black History Month or whatever, there'll be a whole bunch of, rhetoric and activity around that. But in terms of meaningful change, in terms of the number of people that are being given opportunities, a lot of times when you actually look at the data, it hasn't changed, or in some cases it's actually gotten worse, which is kind of remarkable.
Wow.
Which is not to be, I don't mean to be, I think there's hope in that, in the sense of we just need to acknowledge that it's that bad and maybe start thinking about, in my view, I think you just got to think about outside that ecosystem, right? How do we, we can't let that ecosystem continue to determine how our tech industry evolves. It's broken, and as far as I can tell, I mean, it's been decades now. It's not changed. So it doesn't seem like it's going to be fixed from within.
Yeah, I think it's like you said. I think it takes from a grassroots level to do things, and what I'm seeing is a lot, like I said, lots of talk around recruitment and hiring. I am seeing, I guess, examples of sort of Gen Z sort of CEOs trying to, they're trying to be actively involved in either setting up businesses or setting up, because you see a lot of like coding schools and sort of coding workshops and boot camps. What I'm seeing a lot more is, for example, the coding boot camps that encourage women, for example, or those that encourage people from, different backgrounds to write. I'm seeing a lot of those, because a couple of years ago, it was a case where the coding boot camps that you saw, the actual fees to get into them were prohibitively, high. Whereas now you're seeing probably a few more that either they'll either charge a much lower fee, or they'll encourage people to sign on and won't charge them until they secure a role at the end of it. So I don't know if that's an attempt to encourage more people to get involved with tech. And I don't know. I mean, if there's any data that it's even working, but from the sounds of it, it doesn't seem as though it's making an impact where it needs to be making an impact at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's a couple things there that are sort of interesting. I mean, one, there was sort of a predatory inclusion aspect to some of the coding schools, but if they're moving towards a model where they're not charging or they're deferring the fees, maybe that's a little better. And I also think the generational component is possibly a factor. I'm not sure what maybe things as Gen Z begins to get more authority and is more empowered to make change, maybe then things will really change. I would love that. I hope that's the case. And in any case, I do think that the key is saying, well, we just need to invest in these groups that have been historically excluded from the tech industry, because the talent is there, right? So if you're if you're looking for talent and you have the resources, the smartest thing you could do would be to just invest in developing that talent, because they're really, the idea that you're short on talent is just a product of the fact that you're not willing to invest in developing it. Mm-hmm. And so a school where you're saying, okay, well, we'll defer the fees, or even better would be just a scholarship system that evolved from the big, if they're really serious about it, they're saying, well, we don't have enough talent. Well, then, develop the talent. They've got the money to do it if they really wanted to solve the problem.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, and this is why, again, another reason for me, remote work, I probably didn't realize how powerful remote work is until, I really got into the sort of conversations like I'm having with you, the power of remote work. Because I could speak to quite a few people in things like, different remote teams, different remote leaders. Speak to more and more. I'm speaking to women, for example, who have been able to use remote work to get into tech roles, or at least continue their career, continue building their careers. And in some cases, they say to me, it just wouldn't have been possible if I wasn't able to work remotely, for example. So I think if you're aligning sort of the power of working remotely with what you're saying, Dan, in terms of the scholarships and the training aspects of tech, I think that's a powerful sort of like combination that can really get people or encourage people to get into tech, and not just get into it, but just really build careers and see a pathway where they can actually build a career.
That's a great point about remote. I mean, remote removes another barrier, right? Another form of exclusion is saying, well, you have to live in this very expensive city.
Yeah.
And, or you got to take several hours out of your day to commute, right? So that just eliminates a whole bunch of people that either don't have that kind of free time to be commuting all the time, or can't afford to live in San Francisco or, wherever. Remote empowers people to by removing those barriers, and it's not quite the same. And that's why it's been a little bit, predictable maybe, but also a little disappointing to see a lot of the big tech companies insist on having everybody come back. But the same, it is the idea of investing in training and skills development is just another form of that, right? As just removing these barriers. I have a feeling that if we were to do that, if we collectively can remove the barriers to people participating in the economy fully, like, I don't even think anybody has any idea what's even possible with that. We've been essentially it's a very self-defeating thing to exclude so many people from participating fully in the economy. If what you want is economic growth, then you want maybe benefits a few people, but I think in the end, it's collectively just a terribly short-sighted decision to not invest, to not remove those barriers, and hopefully over the next decade or two, we can obliterate those and see what the economy really looks like when everybody's able to contribute.
And this is it. And I think that it was that whole scenario you've just described is the contribution and the pooling resources to get get people exposed to tech, exposed to the right training so they get back into the market. So over the last couple of years, I've been doing a lot of coaching, and one of the areas that has really brought home to me is for example, usually single mothers. So, and single moms between the ages of, say, 27 and 35, where I had a couple of my my clients where they desperately wanted to either rejoin the workforce, having worked in tech, or they wanted to launch their career in tech, but there were so many different hurdles and barriers for them to do that, and there was no sort of there's no sort of clear pathway for them to do that, and there was no real sort of affordable resource for them to do that. And it just made me think to myself, I think certainly there could be a lot more done on this side of the channel anyway, on this side of the ocean.
So I think the same is true here. Yeah.
Definitely, because the governments here, for example, the government here is not. I saw lots of holes in the way that they're sort of all these skilled people, as I said, between those ages, who are experienced workers. They're desperate to get into it, but there's no, as I said. So you think it's the same? It is the same over there as well, right?
Well, certainly that aspect. Yeah. I mean, if you look at, I'm like you, I'm speaking anecdotally from people that I've talked to, but it's sort of also just logically, it kind of makes sense. I mean, childcare is a thing. So if you're, if you go back to the commute scenario, right? So, if you've got to commute in, that means you're paying for childcare for that time, right? So there's an actual cost. And so now whether you're actually paying higher rent or you're paying more childcare, either way, there's this cost for you to participate. Not to mention you're not able to be present around your kids. And I think remote is one of those things that fundamentally changes that dynamic, right? The commute's gone. A lot of times remote makes sense in contexts where flexible hours make sense, which helps helps. If you're a single parent, it helps you be more present in your kids' lives, which I think is, a good thing, obviously. And, so, and then you get into things like, the training aspect of it, right? Which is, again, if you can do the training online in the time that you have, right? The time that you can make, it makes it just much more likely that people are going to be able to get the training and then participate and then get a good job if they can work remotely. So it's it's a complete game changer for some people. Absolutely.
It is, and in fact, it's one of the words that somebody I interviewed the other day used. She said it was a game changer for her. Even, like not just mothers, but myself. I'm a good example myself, because there was a point where I was at home looking after my daughter, and remote work enabled me to continue with my career, not have any sort of real gaps in my career, but at the same time, see my daughter take her first steps, for example, or even just take her to school. Things I used to take for granted taking her to school. Yeah, to be honest. But
how do you even put a price on something like that?
Yes.
That's amazing.
It is. It's. I was looking back on some pictures, and I was thinking to myself, this would not be possible had I not been able to work on a remote basis. Because there was a point where I was working sort of in an office, and I was doing, it was a very heavy sales environment, heavy sort of client pitching environment, where we had to stay late to do these pitches. And sometimes if we did a pitch after, we'd go out after the pitch with the client, that sort of thing, and not get home till sort of 9 o'clock in the evening sometimes. Or even if there wasn't a client pitch, it was sometimes actually just the work itself would mean, not getting home till late, and not, leaving in the morning before everybody got up. And when I got back home, everybody's in bed. So it was incredible.
Right. Yeah. It puts such a constraint around things, because you can't sort of take a short break from work and then hang out with your kid and then go back to work, because there's a commute involved, or there's things like, well, can you get to the meeting on time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that I had always sort of accepted, because I'd heard this a lot from people when I would, people who were in office bound environments, if you will. And they would sometimes say, well, the kinds of things that we're doing, we have a lot of meetings. Would be really hard to do a remote. And I always kind of accepted that. And I think one of the things that the pandemic did is it exposed that as not being the case. We might have, I'm not going to say it was a lie, because I think a lot of people really actually didn't believe that it was possible for them to do their jobs without being in an office. But a lot of people were able to do their jobs, right? And it turned out, the whole economy didn't just collapse. Like, a lot of things just kind of kept going, and certain sectors actually boomed. And so it turns out that that's a myth. It's not really the case that, in fact, it's, I think for a lot of people, what they discovered is that they could actually do their jobs better than they were doing them before. And so what's interesting has been a little bit disappointing is to see a lot of companies say, well, okay, everybody, it's time to come back in the office. But I don't think we're ever going to, like, that's never, you can't unsee that, like even people that are going back into the office are kind of like, well, now I know, right? Now I know this isn't really necessary.
Yes.
And I think that's it may not, things still playing out, but I think, because the discussions now are different, right? People before, and you would know this even better than I, because you were doing this podcast and talking to all these different people about it. Not to turn this around and start interviewing you, but I'd love to hear your perspective on whether this has changed, because before it seemed like there was a lot of, people saying, well, it sounds nice and everything, but I don't think it would work here. And I don't hear that now anymore. It's more like, well, the company's making us come back. There's not really as much of a thing of saying, nobody's even really pretending that it's necessary. At least my question to you would be, is that what you're seeing in these when you're talking to people on the podcast or outside of the podcast, I guess?
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing is, like you're saying, Dad, I think the data shows in terms of productivity, it confirms that people in certain sectors are just as productive, if not more productive, working remotely, working from home. I tell you what, as well, what the pandemic has done is it obviously emphasizes that it was possible. It's also, like you said, pushed remote work to the forefront as a possibility for the future. And again, anecdotally, I think, well, not just anecdotally, but I think lots of, in terms of the job seekers now, perhaps in a situation where they're probably more specific about the kinds of roles that they want now. So they're asking for, if they can't do remote, then they're fully remote, that is, they're being a bit more specific about the sorts of arrangements that they want. So if it's, for example, a couple of days here in the office, a couple of days at home, you're seeing a lot more, in fact, you're seeing a lot more companies, and this is, I don't like this aspect, but you're getting lots of companies advertising roles as remote, but then when you get to the actual point of the interview, they start saying, well, actually, it's 2 days, 2 days at home or 1 day at home, and the rest of it is in the office. So they're realizing that more people are asking for remote opportunities, and they're putting those sorts of things in the job adverts, but it feels like it's under false pretenses, and it feels like it's kind of like a bit of a bait and switch going on to attract people and then sort of change the goalposts, because they realize that, remote roles are basically the flavor of the month, if not the flavor of the decade, to be honest. So yeah.
Right.
And the other thing is, as well, is I speaking to somebody else on the podcast, somebody who's fully into remote work. He's the CEO of Time Doctor, and and I don't know what you think about this, but in terms of the predictions, obviously you're getting lots of bosses now telling their workers to come back into the office that has been a bit of a trend in 2023. But what he predicted was that that's going to play itself out through 2023, start 2024, mid 2024. But beyond 2024 and 2025, you're going to see a lot more companies. For example, the companies that established themselves as fully remote in 2020, at the sort of the end of the pandemic or the height of the pandemic, you're going to see a lot more of those types of companies as a matter of course, so to speak, or kind of those sorts of companies will be more popular. So that in turn will mean that there's going to be more companies offering fully remote opportunities, for example. I don't know what your thoughts on that. Do you think there's going to be more widespread remote opportunities into the future, or do you think there's still going to be a demand by bosses to get people back into the office?
Well, a little bit of both. I think a lot of the established companies, particularly in tech, are probably going to continue to insist on having people in the office, and they have, enough momentum from a, scale and revenue standpoint that they can probably get away with that. But I do think what that really is going to mean is they're going to lose a lot of talent over the next few years, and a newer generation of tech companies that is remote friendly, or not even remote friendly, just remote, like as the default, right?
Yes.
Before the pandemic, part of Panda Strike's whole strategy was just that because we were remote, we could get talent that, it's not as much of an advantage though. So to the point of the Time Doctor CEO, we don't recruit that way anymore. We still recruit as remote being a feature, but it's no longer an advantage for us. There's enough other companies saying that they're fully remote that doesn't distinguish us anymore. And so I think that does speak to the sheer number of opportunities that are available for people that are fully remote. And I think between that and the pandemic exposing as a myth that you can't really, I think people now realize I can do my job remotely. They now are acquainted with the benefits. Like I just spoke with a friend of mine who during, while his company was remote, he took the opportunity to move to a location where he wanted to, place that he wanted to live. And the company is now saying that they want everybody to come back into the office. And, so he's commuting, but, I don't, that's changed the equation for him. He's now realized, I can just live wherever I want. I can live where I want. I can have the lifestyle that I want. And whether that means spending more time with your kids or living in a part of the country that is, that you prefer, it's different for everybody, but everybody now realizes that, they know firsthand now whether or not their job really does require them to be in an office. And for the people who kind of know that it's a myth that they have to be there, I think it's changed the way that they're thinking about it. And they're much more likely to say, well, maybe I should just go find a company that will embrace this. So I do think it may take a while to play out, but I do think it's going to continue to shift. And I also think it's going to be a big advantage for companies if you're, in terms of being able to attract talent. If you're still in that mentality that you're saying, well, we're going to have everybody come back into the office. There's going to be a cost that you're going to pay in terms of the talent that you have available to you to execute. And it takes a while, especially for these big companies that have, just such massive revenue streams, but it'll eventually start hurting them competitively.
I think so. And in your case, the questions I get about, well, not in your case, but the questions I get a lot about remote work, because there's a whole heap of people looking for remote opportunities. I'm not necessarily knowing whether that's sort of being employed or even freelancing, or this is kind of three questions in one, I guess. So for people looking for employment in remote, freelancing, or just to do something in remote, in a remote aspect, maybe we should just start with those who are employed. How would you then, because obviously you hire for your different teams, how would you suggest that people start looking for remote opportunities that suit them?
In terms of, I'm not sure, like, what do you mean how to start looking?
So I think one of the biggest, difficulties, there's lots of competition for remote work, and there's so many different, there's different people professing to have remote roles. There's some unscrupulous people sort of posting roles that are remote. And it can be quite difficult actually to differentiate between the businesses that are offering legitimate roles and those that are not. So I guess what I'm asking is what would you say, somebody who's looking for a remote job, a remote role, how would you sort of recommend they go about not only looking for a role, but also then engaging with a potential employer?
I see. Yeah. As far as the first part of that, I actually am not that, we still just kind of run ads, and we have our network that we put the word out when we're looking for something. So there's nothing, I don't have any particularly useful insights there as far as like, where do you go? I think remote is now common enough that pretty much, any job board or any recruiter you can tell them, you can hit the flag, I'm looking for remote, or tell a recruiter I'm looking for remote, and just look for the remote opportunities. But then when you're really engaging, I think there is some questions you can ask that can help sort of differentiate. One of the most simple things is, how much of the company is remote, and, what's the commitment to remote? Is it, is there any plans to, whether they're in the next 6 months or year or in the indefinite future, is there any plan to say you're going to want people to come back into the office? And, if hopefully they'll be honest about that response. But if you're, and I would say if you're kind of concerned that maybe they're not being honest, then, that's a whole different problem.
Yeah.
But there's also sometimes the fact that the hiring managers themselves may be being misled. So to take that into account, I think, one of the things that, is useful is to kind of get a sense of to what extent has the hiring manager completely adapted to learning how to manage remote. Because managing remote means you're not doing bodies and chairs, right? You don't look around your office and go, okay, everybody's here, they appear to be working. It's funny because I don't know how many times people would ask me or raise the objection, how do you know that people are working? Which I always thought was, I think we might have touched on this in the last, the last time I was on your show, because it's a strange question to ask in the sense that it sort of implies that that you don't have a way of measuring the productivity of your team. Like even on a gut level, I don't necessarily mean that, you're sitting there counting widgets, but just having a sense of, how productive are people being? That's part of being a good manager. So I think if you ask people about how do they assess things, like how do you measure or assess productivity, how do you provide feedback so that I know what I need to improve on or do better? And those are good questions anyway, but remote managers will tend to give, I think, much more concrete answers because they will have been, and they will have adapted to saying, okay, well, I can't see everybody. I can't just go around and chat with people. So I got to actually kind of know how to determine who's getting what done. And if they've got good answers to those questions, that don't depend on people being in an office, then there's a good chance that at least the hiring manager is completely committed to remote. Now whether or not, I think at that point, if you're not sure if it's sometimes these big companies, it's hard the hiring managers don't always know for sure. So I think in those cases, you can always say, well, let me ask some questions of the HR people. And if they're like, yes, we're 100% committed to remote, then, but if they start dancing around the issue, then probably they've been in meetings or something where there's been discussions about, the possibility of asking the employees back.
Yeah, I think the process of job search it's always been about asking questions, but I think even more now it's even more important because of there's so many different there are so many different questions to ask now, just so you're clear on what you're getting into as a job seeker or somebody who's looking for an opportunity. So I like that question. What's the commitment to remote work? That's a pretty good one. And it tells a lot. That should tell you a lot, I think. So yeah, thank you for that, Dan. And in terms of DashKite then, what's on the horizon for you, Dan? What's on the horizon for DashKite in the future?
Well, so we got our first. Well, thank you for asking that question. First of all, we have our first product out, which is a simple. It's called DashKite DB, and it's a simple, doesn't require any programming type of database that you can create the database very easily. You go in, click, boom, you have a database, and then you can put things in and out. It's not there's not a lot of tooling around it to make it easy to put things in and out. It's really just part of a roadmap that we have. The next product we're going to be launching in July is called Sites. Mm-hmm. And Sites is it's a generative website builder, meaning, you can essentially just start putting content in the site, and the application figures out, how to display it so that it looks very nice. So it's kind of like a CMS that also knows how to do web design, is maybe the way you can think about it. We'll hopefully have, a nice. Well, we'll have that. We're planning to do that launch that in July, and maybe have a little bit of a little how-to video that goes along with that to show people how to use it. And then from there, we're going to make it so that it's more interactive, which is why where DashKite DB comes in, because just to be able to do simple things like a form, like a sign-up form. Mm-hmm. You want to store that data somewhere, so. That's the immediate roadmap. We're pretty excited about getting our first product launch. That's always exciting milestone. There was a long period of time where we were kind of in research mode, trying to figure out what we wanted to do and whether we could do what we wanted to try to do. And I think we've had some really good results come out of that, and so it was exciting to get to this point, and we're really excited about, Sites and the roadmap from there, which will build on that and move us towards this vision of just empowering people who don't have traditional programming skills, whether they're visual or coding, to be able to create, interesting applications.
Mm-hmm. No, it sounds good, and of course we'll be keeping an eye on DashKite, on you as well, Dan. There's just one more question I wanted to ask you before we start to wrap up, because we've talked a lot about work, we've talked a lot about remote work, but when you're not working, what kind of things are you generally doing when you're not working, or do you work all the time?
Well, I do work a lot, but I try to make it sustainable. And I think actually one of the things that I often tried to counsel other entrepreneurs on is to get out of the grind mindset. I think the startup grind thing is a somewhat toxic and harmful mentality to be in, because it it's not usually. I think there's maybe times in your life, or I don't want to say that if you're doing that it's maybe what you're doing and it's okay, but for a lot of people it's pretty unhealthy. And there's just so much talk about grind. That's how you get an advantage. And the reality is a lot of times past a certain point, there's kind of diminishing returns, right?
Yeah.
There's only so much productive energy that you have, and then you have to kind of recharge and live to fight another day. So, I live out here in Marina Del Rey, I'm very fortunate to be able to live here. And so I can go down, I go down to the beach, just sometimes just stare at the water, and that becomes part of, I find that it's a strange, I don't know why, but for some reason just being around the ocean has this effect on me of just refreshing me and clearing my head. And, I enjoy, I've been watching, some shows. I watched The Last of Us, which I thought was great. And, been watching Succession recently, which is a kind of a fun, if very warped. I don't know if you're keeping up with any of the shows, but
well, there's one show that I was watching. I mean, it is quite warped. It's quite old, but Breaking Bad.
Oh, that's one of my favorites. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, My wife started watching that, and I was thinking, well, what's this that she's watching? Because I don't normally watch Netflix. And then I started sitting down to watch it, and I was thinking, it was really addictive for me. And I've actually started to watch it from the beginning again. It's great.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those shows where there's a lot of little things that you notice the second time through.
Yeah.
That are hinting at what's going to come down the road. And, it's a rewarding show to watch twice. Plus the visual storytelling in that show is just kind of fascinating to watch. It's very engrossing just on its own. But if you enjoy that, when you're done with that, you got to watch Better Call Saul.
Okay, Better Call Saul. Okay, I'm making a note of that. My trusty pen. Yeah, he was a good character in that. But I mean, for me, there was so many characters in that you could just create a film around. It's like even Mike, Mike, the guy with the bald head. I could, yeah. But anyway, that was my favorite.
I mean, that's kind of what Better Call Saul sort of picks up on, right? It's not just about Saul. It sort of dives into like, how did all those characters get to where they were at the beginning of Breaking Bad? And Mike is definitely featured. We need to do another podcast, or you should do another podcast on Breaking Bad.
I could easily do that. That might be a podcast idea for me there. I'll make a note of that as well. It's a podcast idea for the future. But no, it's been great, Dan. The thing is, whenever I interview you, I've always got more and more questions that I want to ask. But of course, I don't want to take up too much time because I know you're busy. So maybe there's a part 3 in it, who knows. But thank you for being with me again on the Remote Work Life podcast. And I hope to again speak to you in the future. And I'll be sure to keep up to date with what you're doing.
Yeah, let's it's a pleasure. First of all, I always enjoy these. And the 2 that we've done have been great. And let's maybe not wait 3 years.
Definitely
the next one.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Once again, thanks, Dan, and I will be in touch. I'll be speaking to you again in the future and keeping an eye on what you, Panstrike, and DashKite are going to be doing. Thank you.
Well, likewise. Take care.